for joining me on the news at this hour. U.S. seeks ammunition supply to Ukraine from Japan. The United Nations warns of increase in drug crime in Southeast Asia. Moscow foils more attacks on Belgorod. U.S. to stop sharing data with Russia on the New Deal, and debt ceiling deal passes U.S. Senate. Heads to Biden. The United States is looking to secure supplies of TNT in Japan for 155 mm artillery shells as Washington rushes weapons and ammunition to Ukraine for a planned counter-offensive against Russian troops. For pacifist Japan, any procurement could cause controversy because export rules ban Japanese companies from selling lethal items overseas, such as the howitzer shells that Ukraine fires daily at Russian units occupying its southeastern regions. Nonetheless, the allies appear to have found a workaround to permit the TNT sale amidst global shortages of munitions. Two people familiar with the matter said, according to reports. Export restrictions for dual-use products or equipment sold commercially are less strict than for items with purely military purpose. Tokyo, which hosted U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin this week, has told the U.S. government it will permit the sale of industrial TNT because the explosive is not a military-use-only product, the other source said. The U.S. wants to add a Japanese company into a TNT supply chain to deliver explosives to U.S. Army-owned ammunition plants that will pack them into 155 mm shell cases, the person added. Japan's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Economy refused to say whether any Japanese company had approached it about exporting TNT. It added in an email that items not subject to military curbs will be evaluated under regular export rules that consider the buyer's intent, including whether their use will impede international security. The Japanese Defense Ministry's Acquisition, Technology and Logistics Agency declined to comment. The U.S. State Department said Washington was working with allies and partners to provide Ukraine with the support it needs to defend itself. Japan, it added, has demonstrated leadership in supporting Ukraine's defense. The United Nations has warned that the synthetic drugs market in Southeast and East Asia is becoming more diverse, and drug trafficking syndicates are using fresh smuggling routes to ship large quantities of methamphetamine and other drugs throughout the region. Close to 151 tons of methamphetamine was seized in Southeast and East Asia last year, as well as a record 27.4 tons of ketamine, marking a 167% addition in the seizure of the powerful sedative compared to 2021, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, said on Friday. Launching its newest report on the situation of synthetic drugs in the two regions, the UNODC noted that record methamphetamine seizures have been logged almost every year in Southeast and East Asia over the past decade, though 2022 showed a leveling in drugs seized back to pre-COVID-19 quantities. But this may have less to do with decrease in production and supply than traffickers turning to new smuggling routes to avoid interception. In an attempt to avoid detection, organized crimes group in the Golden Triangle, the largely lawless region where the borders of northern Thailand, Myanmar and Laos meet, have moved considerable amounts of crystal methamphetamine through the central region of military-controlled Myanmar to the Andaman Sea, UNODC said. This was in addition to the hauls that continue to be smuggled through northern Thailand and Laos. Transnational organized crime groups anticipate, adapt and try to work to circumvent rather what governments do, and in 2022 we saw them walk around Thai's borders in the Golden Triangle more than in the past, Jeremy Douglas, UNODC regional representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, said in a statement. Commenting on the new routes through central Myanmar, where the military is engaged in an intensifying military campaign against pro-democracy forces, Douglas said it seems few were looking in that particular direction. While the Golden Triangle and Myanmar's Shan State continue to be a center of synthetic drug production and opium cultivation in the region, organized crime gangs are also protecting themselves against risk by setting up new production centers elsewhere, Cambodia being an example, according to the UNODC. Regional authorities also uncovered large shipments of mixed methamphetamine and ketamine cargoes, which indicated that crime groups are pushing the two drugs as a passage to grow ketamine demand in new markets, the United Nations agency said. The Russian-Ukraine war, Russia's defense ministry has said it thwarted 3 cross-border attacks near the town of Shebekino as it blamed Ukraine of using what it said were terrorist formations. Shebekino lies in the Belgorod region, which has been beleaguered in a number of attacks since May. Overall, the attack involved up to 70 militants, 5 tanks, 4 armored vehicles, 7 pickup trucks and a Kamaz truck. On Thursday evening, the Russian Defense Ministry reported at least 3 attempted crossings. It said it used air defense, Air Force and artillery to prevent the attacks and killed over 50 Ukrainian fighters. The Russian Volunteer Corps RVC, a far-right paramilitary group of ethnic Russians that supports Ukraine, claimed to be fighting inside Russia. Another anti-Kremlin group that calls itself the Freedom of Russian Legion also announced a plan to launch a cross-border raid. The Belgorod region saw an unprecedented 2-day armed incursion last week and has come under intensified fire in the past days. Ukraine denies its military is involved in the incursions and says they are conducted by Russian volunteer fighters. The Belgorod region's governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, accused Ukrainian armed forces of repeatedly shelling Shebekino with Soviet-designed Grad 122mm rockets, setting alight a dormitory and damaging an administrative building. Gladkov said at least 12 people have been wounded in the past 24 hours. Residents poured into centers for displaced people in Belgorod city. The RVC and Freedom of Russian Legion claim responsibility for the last month's cross-border raid that marked one of the most serious attacks on Russian territory since Moscow began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Moving ahead, the United States will stop giving Russia some notifications needed under the New START Nuclear Arms Control Treaty, including updates on missile and launcher locations in what Washington describes as a reciprocal countermeasure due to Moscow's violations of the accord. On Thursday, the U.S. State Department said it had ceased providing the status and locations of its nuclear missiles and launchers, but will continue to provide notification of the launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Russian inspection activities on U.S. territory have ceased and visas issued and pending for Russian New START Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty inspectors and their air crews, as well as diplomatic clearance for Russian inspection aircraft have been revoked, according to a State Department fact sheet released on Thursday. The U.S. will also not provide telemetric information to Russia on the launch of U.S. intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Such data involves information that originates during a missile's test flights, and under the treaty, both Moscow and Washington were to exchange such information yearly. The State Department said in the fact sheet release on Thursday that the United States has adopted lawful countermeasures in response to the Russian Federation's ongoing violations of the New START Treaty. The Russian Federation's purported suspension of the New START Treaty is legally invalid. The United States notified Russia of the countermeasures in advance and conveyed the United States' desire and readiness to reverse the countermeasures and fully implement the treaty if Russia returns to compliance. It added, Russian President Vladimir Putin has not formally withdrawn from the New START Treaty, but in February he announced that Moscow will suspend its participation in what is the key pillar of U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control. Putin said Moscow could not accept U.S. inspections of its nuclear sites under the agreement when Washington and its NATO allies had openly declared Moscow's defeat in Ukraine as a primary aim. In March, Moscow emphasized that it had not withdrawn from the START Pact altogether and will continue to respect the caps on nuclear weapons, the treaty says. Russia's foreign ministry had also said that Moscow will continue to notify the U.S. of planned test launches of its ballistic missiles, a key element of the agreement. Back to the United States. The United States Senate has voted to approve a bipartisan deal that will add to the country's debt ceiling, clearing the bill's last major difficulty before it reaches the office of President Joe Biden. With Biden anticipated to sign the newly passed bill, Thursday's decision is planned to avert economic catastrophe with only days remaining before the U.S. was due to default on its debt on June 5th. Senators voted 63 to 36 in favor of the legislation, which was thrashed out in often late-night negotiations between teams representing the Democratic Biden and Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, two figures often at odds last weekend. It was passed by the House of Representatives on Wednesday. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on Thursday, "We are avoiding defaulting tonight," as he steered the legislation through the 100-member chamber where the Democrats have a razor-thin majority. Biden welcomed the bill's approval as a big win for our economy and the American people. He said he will make an additional statement on Friday at 7 p.m. 23 hours GMT. In the lead-up to Thursday's vote, Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell rallied support from their respective parties to back the deal, which will suspend the federal borrowing limits until January 2025. On more stories, treason trial of Russian scientist commences. A well-known Russian scientist involved in the country's hypersonic missile program has gone on trial, accused of state treason amid stringent secrecy and worries over the health of the elderly defendant. On Thursday, Anatoly Maslov's trial opened in St. Petersburg, the first case against 3 hypersonic missile scientists who worked at an institute in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk and who are now facing what the Kremlin has said are very serious accusations. The trial, marked as top secret, is close to the media and public, the St. Petersburg Court has said. Maslov's lawyer could not be reached for comments on the opening of the proceedings. A source close to Maslov, 76, said according to reports that the missile scientist had suffered 2 heart attacks and spent time in hospital since his arrest last June in Novosibirsk. Doctors in the pretrial detention center have not given Maslov access to all the medication prescribed by his normal physician, the source said. Maslov was a professor and researcher at the Kristianovich Institute of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics, one of Russia's top scientific centers. All 3 defendants are specialists in hypersonics, a field of major importance to the development of Russia's next generation of missiles capable of flying at 10 times the speed of sound. Colleagues at the Kristianovich Institute issued an open letter on May 15th in support of the 3 jailed scientists that are attested to their innocence and patriotism, noting that the accused has shunned the possibility of highly paid jobs overseas to dedicate themselves to serving Russian science. Details of the accusations against the 3 are classified, but the news portal of Science City, where they are based, said Maslov was suspected of passing secrets to China. In African scenes, at least 9 killed in Senegal protest. The country's interior ministry said at least 9 people were killed in Senegal in clashes between riot police and supporters of opposition leader Ousmane Sonko following a court sentencing him to 2 years in prison. Clashes broke out after Thursday's verdict, which may disqualify Sonko, President Macky Sall's fastest opponent, from contesting next year's presidential polls. Vehicles were set ablaze in the city capital, Dakar, and disturbances were reported elsewhere, including the city of Ziguinchor, where Sonko has been mayor since 2022. We have noted with regret violence that has led to the destruction of public and private property, and unfortunately 9 deaths in Dakar and Ziguinchor, Interior Minister Antonio Diome said on national television on Friday. Sonko, 48, did not attend the hearing over an alleged sexual assault where he was accused of raping a woman who worked in a massage parlor in 2021 when she was 20 and making death threats against her. He denied wrongdoing and said the charges were politically motivated. The court cleared Sonko of rape but found him guilty of a separate offense described in the Penal Code as immoral behavior towards individuals younger than 21. The Justice Ministry said the opposition leader could now be taken to prison at any time. Police remain stationed around his home in Dakar as unrest spread in the capital and elsewhere after the verdict. Sonko's party said the verdict was part of a political plot and called on citizens in a statement to stop all activity and take to the streets. Sonko, a former civil servant, rose to prominence in presidential elections in 2019, coming third after a campaign that took aim at President Sall at the country's ruling elite. He portrays Sall as corrupt and a would-be dictator, while the president's supporters call Sonko a rabble-rouser who has sown instability. His initial arrest on rape charges in 2021 triggered any days of clashes that left at least 12 people dead. On Thursday, thick black smoke billowed from a Central University campus in Dakar, where protesters set several vehicles alight in the afternoon and threw rocks at riot police, who responded by firing tear gas. Government spokesperson Abdul Karim Fofana said security forces had the situation under control in the capital. Let's go on a quick break, and when we come back, I'll bring you more stories. Welcome back. Kyari, no going back on fuel subsidy. Mele Kyari, the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, NNPCL, says no going back on the removal of fuel subsidy. Speaking during a consultative meeting with the Senator Abdullahi Adamu-led National Working Committee (NWC) of the ruling All Progressives Congress (APC) in Abuja, he maintained that the subsidy regime can no longer be sustained in the country. The NNPCL chief argued that Nigeria, as well as the 36 state governments of the Federation, will no longer be credit-worthy any moment from now under the prevailing subsidy regime. He argued that contrary to the widely held notions, the rich rather than the poor remain the major beneficiary of the fuel subsidy regime, admitting that the removal of fuel subsidy will visit untold hardship on Nigerians. He said the hope that the attendant cost of living that will come with the measure will fizzle out in due course. President Tinubu addresses service chiefs. Tinubu said he will no longer accept a situation in which the nation's fortunes keep deteriorating in what was his first meeting with the security chiefs. He said in his own path, national security has to be coordinated and that there must be a clearinghouse going forward. Major General Babangana Mungono, retired National Security Advisor (NSA), who addressed State House correspondents at the end of the meeting, said the president mandated security agencies to come up with a blueprint declaring he doesn't have the luxury of time and that whatever changes that has to be made will be made as soon as possible. Mungono said the meeting was held between the president and members of the General Security Appraisal Committee, consisting of the Chief of Staff, Service Chiefs, Inspector General of Police and heads of the intelligence agencies. According to him, the meeting lasted 2 hours and that having been briefed by the participants of the meeting, the president addressed prevailing issues confronting the nation in terms of insecurity and also mentioned his own philosophy towards dealing with national security issues. The NSA quoted the president as saying all agencies must work to achieve one single purpose. Working at cross purposes and colliding with each other is not something that he will condone. The service chiefs were led to the meeting by Chief of Defense Staff General Lucky Irabo. Those present were Chief of Army Staff Lieutenant General Farouk Yahaya, Chief of Naval Staff Vice Admiral Awal Gambo, Chief of Air Staff Air Marshal Isiaka Amao, Inspector General of Police Usman Alkali Baba, Director General of the Department of State Services DSS Yusuf Bichi, Director General of National Intelligence Agency NIA Ahmed Rufai Abubakar. And finally, on the news, Central Bank of Nigeria refutes Naira devaluation report. The Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, said it has not devalued the Naira, urging the public to dismiss any contrary report. Dr. Isa Abdul Mimin, Acting Director, Corporate Communications, said this in a statement titled CBN has not devalued the Naira. He said the attention of the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, has been drawn to a news report titled CBN devalues Naira to 630/31. We wish to state categorically that this news report, which in the imagination of the media is exclusive, is complete with outright lies and destabilizing insinuations, reflecting potentially willful ignorance of the said medium as to the workings of the Nigerian foreign exchange market. For the avoidance of doubt, the exchange rate at investors and exporters, i.e. window traded yesterday morning, June 1st, 2023, at 465 Naira per $1 US dollar rather, and has been stable around this rate for a while. The bank advised the public to ignore the news report in its wholeness, saying it's speculative and calculated at causing panic in the markets. Media practitioners are advised to verify the facts from the Central Bank of Nigeria before publishing in order not to misinform the public. To refresh our memories, US 6 ammunition supply to Ukraine from Japan. United Nations warns of increase in drug crime in Southeast Asia. Moscow foils more attacks on Belgorod. US to stop sharing data with Russia on the New Deal, and debt ceiling deal passes US Senate head to Biden. Thanks for watching. I am Lois Duraki. Enjoy your weekend.